Built Better, the podcast for home improvement contractors by Modernize Home Services.
Welcome back to Built Better, a podcast by Modernize Home Services. We previously connected with Mark Dawson. He's the Chief Operating Officer of 1 Hour Heating and Air Conditioning, to discuss the steps he's taken to establish effective communication as the driving force for the success of the 1 Hour Heating and Air franchise family. In this episode, we talk with Mark about how to become a successful leader and mentor for your teams and how to overcome conflict. Without further ado, let's dive in.
Are you familiar with the term psychological safety? The idea of teams feeling like they can kind of speak their mind, be free without any sort of consequences within the organization. So think of communication at its most ideal level, right? Like we can be very honest with each other and not fear any sort of consequences necessarily. The idea with that term, though, and you kind of touched on it, I'd love you to elaborate a little bit, is when they've done the studies, and Amy Edmondson and Timothy Clark are some of the pioneers in it, what they came to realize is that it's the behavior of the leader of a team that influences the culture the most, right? So although everybody should be paying attention to it, what they found is that, we are all essentially a company built of teams. And it's the leader of those individual teams' responsibility to kind of set the stage, very much like you were talking about being a role model. They also have to be that role model. And so when you think of communication and kind of maybe passing down some of those principles that need to seep through those individual franchisees, is there any tips that you can give or any advice that you could give to companies listening?
Well, I mean, just from a communication standpoint, is just be honest, right? I just feel like that's the best policy. Sometimes that's going to hurt, right? Because you're going to tell someone something they may not want to hear, or vice versa. But I believe if you start at that point, you can have a professional conversation that is going to be worthy and impactful to both parties. And so if the answer is no, right, or whatever the answer is, then say what it is and then help them understand why you feel that way. But also at the same time, listen to why they feel the way they do. And I think if you have that type of conversation, I think you can work out any problem or anything that's going on in the business. You can figure it out. It's when you have a combative conversation that's going to go nowhere. And it's not productive for any party. And so I always try to find common ground. Always, I'm respectful. I don't expect people to raise voices in the conversation. We never use bad language, and we're always respectful. And that's one of the things I tell the franchisees and I tell my teams, like, look, we're going to be respectful to each other. We may not agree on a certain subject from time to time, but we're going to work together to find a common ground and a common platform that we can move forward. And in most times we do that, right? And so I had a conversation yesterday with the franchisee which turned in a 10-minute conversation, turned into an hour, but it was a great conversation, right? He told us how he was feeling about a couple things, and we told him our position, and we talked about it. And at the end of the day, it was worth the conversation. And he's like, I apologize for taking so much time. And I'm like, no. That's what we're here for, right? We've got to communicate to understand how you feel and how we feel so we can move together arm in arm.
Yeah, you bring up a great point. Just how you manage conflict is really essential to how a business can kind of be self-reflective and grow from learning from that conflict. I mean, can you think of anything that comes to mind that you've had in flushing out some of that conflict? Maybe it's respectful conflict essentially, but when there's problems, like how did you kind of attend to that problem, and then how did that permeate throughout your organization? Is there anything that just pops up when you think about that?
So, I mean, if you have a franchisee that has a concern and that's bothering them, then let's get it out on the table. So, and sometimes that may be multiple conversations. Sometimes I can't solve that situation right there on the spot. I may need to get more information to be able to give them better information so they can make a better decision. And so whether it's one conversation or 5 conversations, we're committed to working with our franchisees to resolve any challenge they have in their business. And so, and we work very hard to make sure, because we have a vested interest in their success. And so whether they're having a challenge around the operations side or the marketing side or recruiting or just the numbers themselves, we're going to work with them to make sure we get that. If they're having a challenge with a strategy that we have, right, that doesn't really maybe not fit neatly within their business model, then we try to help them understand what that picture looks like for not just them, but for the betterment of the entire system. And so sometimes being part of a team, someone has to sacrifice for the good of the team, even though it may not fit their business model perfectly. And so we have those types of conversations from time to time. And usually I can't think of a time we haven't been able to come to a resolution and be able to move forward. But again, sometimes those conversations take, many, many times of going over it and looking at the details. And, and here's the thing, if we're wrong, then there's nothing wrong with admitting you're wrong, right? And make a better decision with better information. And I think by doing that, you build trust, you build respect, and it shows that from an integrity standpoint, you're trying to do the right thing for their business and for the system. So I think that works well for us.
Now, Mark, most of the listeners aren't going to be in your position in the sense that they don't have maybe franchisees. They're not part of an organization like that, but they may have, obviously employees or direct reports, teams of people. Some of the clients are contractors are going to have multiple locations, which I think there are some similarities. Do you see any difference in maybe your strategies in communicating within your organization? Do you see differences in how maybe a contractor may operate with a second location that he owns that's, farther away? Or is communication essentially the same regardless?
For me, it's the same, right? And I mean, you get to know people's personality and their profiles and how you can talk to them, what you can say, what you can't say, and that's just part of being an individual. But pretty much they're the same for me, right? And so it's and the biggest key is listening, and which is the hardest thing to do in any conversation, because a lot of times you have all this information, you have all this knowledge that you want to share with the franchisee of how you can help them. But if you're not listening, you're going to miss the key points. So the one thing that we talk about internally is really slowing down and listening to a franchisee of what they're feeling, what they're talking about, and then how to help them and try to get that resolved in an easier way. So, but listening is going to be key.
Yeah, they say, right? Nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care.
That's it.
Lots of listening involved. No, I appreciate that.